Give it just a few seconds, hey, when the timer is down here, just with this slide, I think. And then you can bring it in.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, wrong button. We already failed. All right, so I think now would be a good time to start. So welcome everyone to the 10 Ways Angular 2 Makes Development Easier by Chris Sevilleja and our buddy Ryan Chenkie. And I'm gonna get away from the screens real quick and we'll show our faces and we'll just make this real quick and say hello. So hello everyone, welcome to our very first Angular 2, our first ever webinar. And I'm Chris Sevilleja, co-founder of Scotch. You might have been around our site, read a couple of our articles, and I can't thank you enough for the support. You've helped grow the site over the past 3 years, and you've helped kind of go along this journey with us on learning development. And thank you guys very much. So we'd like to give back a little bit more. So this is our first ever webinar. And
hey guys. Hey guys, it's Ryan here. Just wanted to jump in and say hello as well. So we're really excited here to have be having this webinar and delivering all the kind of Angular goods to you guys, a bunch of the stuff that Chris and I really like about Angular 2 and why we think it can be good for you. So yeah, we're really kind of excited to see what you guys think afterwards too.
All right, right on. So we'll get started. We'll go into the slides, some introductions, and we'll go right to the 10 reasons why we really like Angular 2. So let's get started. So the 10 ways Angular 2 makes development easier. We just want to set it straight right now. You might have heard a lot of things about Angular 2. It's a huge giant difference from Angular 1, and that's true in a lot of cases, but there's a lot of the concepts that carry over that make Angular 2 easy to use. So we'll be talking about our 10 favorite reasons. Real quick, let's do a little more intro. We have me, Chris Sevilleja, co-founder of Scotch. We just recently launched Scotch School to do video courses for you guys. And our webinars, and we have a lot more in planned for 2017, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. And joining me is Ryan.
So once again, guys, my name's Ryan. So a little bit about me. I'm a Google developer expert for web technologies. So that's been since about the middle of this year. I've been in the GDE program. For work, I am a product owner at Auth0. So you may have heard of Auth0. We're an authentication and identity company, and we do all sorts of things that makes Auth and the various pieces around Auth really easy. So check out Auth0 if you have any concerns about authentication. And just very, very recently, founder of a brand new site called Angular Casts, and that's available at angularcast.io. And I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about that later, but basically it's a screencast site to give you kind of all the goods about Angular and Angular 2 in particular, and kind of a lot about the modern web development ecosystem, really. If you want to find me on Twitter, there it is, twitter.com/Ryan Chenkie, and say hi to me on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. So one thing we also want to mention is that we want to take your questions for this webinar. So if you do have any questions, feel free to tweet at us. So get on Twitter, mention Scotch.io, and use the handle, use the hashtag rather, Scotchnar, and put in your questions there. We'll start to see them in Twitter, and we'll answer those questions at the end for you. All right, so let's jump into it. So the question that we really want to get to today is, does Angular 2 make life easier? That's what Chris and I want to try to convince you of in some ways. But you might be wondering, whether that could actually be the case. You might have heard that Angular 2 is this kind of newish and really crazy difficult type of framework, and there's a whole crazy ecosystem around it. And so you might have heard things like, Angular 2 uses ES6 and 7, so these latest, the latest version of JavaScript, and it also uses TypeScript. So you might have heard that there's this whole need to learn a whole new language kind of around the framework just to make use of it. So you might be thinking that why would I bother with Angular 2 when I have to learn TypeScript and it's this weird thing. You might have heard too that there's like this whole build step involved. There's this need to kind of transpile your TypeScript code and bundle everything up and then serve that up. And that can be really tricky, and it involves all sorts of different new concepts like loaders and that sort of thing. And then there's this whole thing about, the environment around Angular 2 and this need to have this environment that caters to being able to serve an Angular 2 application and be able to make it run. And those things, they can be a little bit tricky when you take them at face value, but we'd like to take some time today to talk to you about why they're actually really cool things. And we'll start off with ES6 and ES7, so the latest version of JavaScript. And Chris will talk to you a bit about that.
All right, so ES6 and ES7, and these are the latest, newest versions of JavaScript. So ES6 stands for ECMAScript, which is kind of a weird way to name JavaScript, and that's really what JavaScript is it's ECMAScript. So when the Angular 2 team started working on Angular 2, when they made the jump from Angular 1 to Angular 2, they said, you know what, let's use the latest version of JavaScript. Let's push things forward, and we'll use ECMAScript 6, or ECMAScript 2015, as they call it. So what about ES5? That's what we know, that's what we've been using, and that's how we build all of our applications so far, including all our Angular 1 apps. Well, it's still in our workflow. ES5 is going to be still valid, completely there, and ES6 is a superset of ES5. So all of your ES5 features will work the same exact way you expect them to in ES6 and ES7. Now, the trick to this is that ES6 and ES7, some of their features aren't fully supported in modern day browsers. And although they're getting implemented, some are still not supported. So what we have is a build step, and this is one of the reasons why working with ES6 or Angular 2 can be a little bit daunting, is you have to have this build step where you transpile down to ES5. So what that really means is we're taking all of your ES6, ES7 code, and then we'll turn it into ES5 so that our browsers can actually use it. And the way to do that is to use a transpiler. Something like Babel is a tool that we can use, and we'll talk about another tool that we can use pretty quickly in a second here. So ES6, ES7 features. This is a major upgrade to JavaScript. So what does it include? And we have arrow functions, generators, and the list goes on and on and on. And this is a huge upgrade for JavaScript, and really, really great stuff that you can start playing with. But I mean, the list goes on and on, but the real ones that we want to focus on that are going to make your syntax a little bit cleaner are arrow functions. And we'll show some code on that in a second. Template strings, which are really easy, but they make our code a lot simpler. And the two that are really big for Angular 2 are classes and module loaders. And module loaders can be seen as, if you've ever worked with Node where you have to require modules like that, module loaders, JavaScript loaders have their own way to do things called imports. So look at all those great features. Can I use that all right now? And the answer is, with the right tools, yes. So we talked about having a transpiler. So a lot of those ES6, ES7 things got brought down to ES5. And for module loading, we need another tool. So let's talk about those tools. Transpiling to go from ES6, 7 down to ES5. We're going to use Babel or TypeScript. And TypeScript can do the transpiling for us down to ES5, just like Babel can. The cool thing is that TypeScript adds a little bit extra on top of the transpiling feature. And the next thing is module loading. How do we module load in our browser applications? System.js and Webpack are those tools. So these two sides of the coin kind of are the reason why Angular 2 is a little bit harder to get into than Angular 1. In Angular 1, you just dropped in and script tag and started working. But here, it's a little bit different. So let's do a little bit of a demo on ES6 and ES7 features. So we'll open up Visual Studio Code, and here I have a sample.js file. And notice this is a .js file right now that we're working with. So let's bring this to some ES6 features. Right now we have this function speak. Let's use that as an arrow function. So we can say constant, which is also an ES6 feature, instead of doing a var. We'll say speak is equal to message, and we'll use the arrow function, and we'll return my, and this is a backtick for template strings, my message is, and notice we concatenate it up here. We don't have to do that anymore. We can do this message, and that is how we can write this function in ES6 using arrow functions and template strings. Now you might be saying, nah, that's cool and all, but that doesn't really help me too much. But once we start working with larger functions like this service call that you might see in Angular 1, this can really simplify things where you just say data arrow users is equal to data.users. So now we can one-line a lot of things in our applications and start to simplify things. Now, one thing I'd like to do here, we'll save this. One of the reasons we'll get into for number 2, our number 2 reason is TypeScript. But I'd really like to take a quick change here. We'll rename this file to a TypeScript file. And immediately, TypeScript is able to give us some errors on what is going on in our application. And notice if we had a JavaScript file, we weren't going to see those errors until later in our app when we start working in the browser. So right now, if we go to dist, and let's look at the ES5 code that gets pulled out from that file. Let's split these in two, close that sidebar. Now we have our function here on the left, and what it gets created down to ES5 is this function like we had earlier. And this arrow function data users gets turned into .then function data users. So that's kind of the stuff that ES5 transpiling down and ES6 does for us. Simple stuff, but cleans up our code a lot. So with that said, let's move on to number 2, which is going to be, that's the wrong slide. Let's move on to number 2, which is TypeScript. And this is one of the really big reasons why some people are kind of reluctant to jump into Angular 2. So while you can create Angular 2 applications in pure JavaScript, the Angular 2 team has used TypeScript and said, this is the way we're going to go. So why would we use TypeScript? Like, what benefits does it give us? It is going to be able to transpile for us. That's one of its features. But what does it do on top of that? Really, the best thing that it does for us is it helps us find mistakes early. If you mess up, TypeScript will tell you. Now let's look at ES6, ES7. ES6 and 7 is a superset of ES5, and TypeScript is a superset of that. So all of your ES6, ES7 features, ES5 features can be used in TypeScript. And you can say that by, we just changed the JS file to a TS file, and it still worked. And we transpile down to ES5. So let's look at a really quick example. This is a function add AB, and we're passing in 2 parameters. And let's try to use that function later on. We'll have add, and we'll throw in a string and a number as the parameters. Now, JavaScript won't tell us there's an error. We'll probably find that error when we run this in our browser and start using it there. But if we change this to a TypeScript file, and we add a number and a number here, so basically we're just saying type hint this as has to be a number and has to be a number. TypeScript will go ahead and tell us that this string is not assignable to a type of number. So really simple thing there, but you can see how you can start to catch errors really quickly while you're coding in your editor. So let's do a TypeScript demo right here. Go back into Visual Studio. We'll have the same sample file. And right now we're using speak, where we pass in a string. And then let's say we had a robot friend who tried to use the speak function and passed in some binary number. But that's a number, and that should throw an error for us. So here we're going to type in this as a string, and immediately we can see that the error, we can't pass in a number for this, so that is a problem here. We'll fix that. Users isn't defined anywhere, so we'd have to say let users or constant users. And this would probably work better in a component that we had for Angular 1. Also, for person, we're creating a new person here where we use Ryan, but this person class wants a name and a username. So really, we have to actually pass in two parameters here. We'll pass in Ryan's username here, and now our errors are gone. So very simple stuff with TypeScript, and that only scratches the surface of what it can do for us. But it really helps to kind of simplify our code and catch errors early. And that's really what we want. We want to develop faster and with less errors. So let's move forward. We'll go into number 3. Number 3 is speed and performance. Super fast for all your applications. They really did a great job, the Google team and the Angular 2 team, at redoing the compiler for Angular 2 and making that really performant. So really, we're looking at 5 times faster for your applications just by using Angular 2 over Angular 1. And to talk about why that is, a lot of how that works is how the data flow happens in our applications. Right now in Angular 1, we have two-way data binding. So you get a parent component and some child components. Data moves in between both of those. And as your applications start to get larger, it starts to get harder to kind of see how your data flows in your app. In Angular 2, we're going to have the parent component always pass information down to its children components. So data goes down, and then when we want data to propagate up, we're going to have the child component emit an event, and if the parent wants to, it'll listen for that event and then pass that data down as well. So event goes up, data goes down. The next really cool feature that Angular 2 provides for speed and performance is ahead-of-time compiling. Right now, we have just-in-time compiling, which is the default for Angular applications. And what that really means is we're going to ship all our code to the browser, and this square is the browser here. And in that browser, we're going to use the Angular 2 compiler. We're going to parse and generate some code, and then we'll render that to our browser. Now, the thing is the compiler makes up for about 50% of the payload for our Angular 2 apps. So if we can take that compiler and move it before we send information to the browser, and then send it to the browser after it's already compiled ahead of time, then we can just render, and now our applications are 2.5 times faster for load times. Our applications are 3 times smaller, which really helps when we're talking about sending payloads to, mobile applications and mobile devices on some not that great networks. And then the last feature that we'll talk about performance, although it is not a full list at all, it's tree shaking. And this is, you can imagine you have your code in this application, you just shake this tree, and anything that you don't use in your app, so you have unused code, it just gets pulled out and your payload gets even smaller. So these are 3 really big things of how Angular kind of goes ahead and says, we want to make your apps as performant as possible. So moving forward, let's get into number 4. And number 4 is consistent concepts. And we'll pass that off to Ryan.
So if there's something that I really like when I get to learn a new framework or a new library or anything like that, it's when I can see some consistency in whatever it is I'm using. And when I'm not having to kind of guess as to how to use various pieces of the framework or the library or whatever it is. And one of the things that I really like about Angular 2, and I would say really kind of makes life easy, is that there's a lot of consistency in these various concepts that we've got. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'd start off by saying, one of the ways that you can get really proficient with Angular to do things really quickly is if you learn kind of these few things about dynamic templates. So if we think of dynamic templates, we're thinking of the views for our application. So you'd maybe create some view that has some data in it, and that view would change based on the state of your application. And if you can learn some things about dynamic templates, you can kind of hit the ground running with writing a real Angular 2 application. And so what I'd call them is the 4 pillars of dynamic templates, these things that I want to kind of share with you that I think are really, really kind of cool from Angular. One of them is pretty familiar if you're coming from Angular 1, and that's interpolation. So you've probably seen this before. It's the double curly braces. You've probably seen this or something similar to it in other languages and other frameworks as well. And this is basically where we can take some kind of property or some piece of data, and we can have that be interpolated for us in one of our elements. So the example here is we've got a p tag, for instance, and we've got some message that's maybe populated somewhere in our component. And that message is going to be interpolated out. So whatever the value of that message is, it's going to display that value on the screen when your app renders. The next one that's kind of new in Angular 2 is called property binding. And property binding is where we use the square brackets to tie something to a property of an element. And the way that this works is if we have some data in our component and we want to push that to our view, we can bind that and have it evaluate to some property on some element. So the example here is if you had like an image tag, for instance, and maybe you had some kind of user object and you had an image key on that user object, you can use the square brackets, the property binding brackets, we'll call them, to bind the value of that user.image to your image tag. And that'll create a dynamic setup for you where if the value of that image key changes, that's going to change your image tag. The next one is what we'll call event binding. And event binding kind of goes the other way. It's if you want to take something from your view and push something to your component logic. And the way that this works is you use the parentheses, and then you pass the name of some event that you want to handle, some event that you want to have handled, rather, some event that you want to listen for. The example here is if you do a button, you can put a click event into the parentheses, and then you can call some method on your some method in your component. This is similar if you're coming from Angular 1 to ng-click, but in this case, we use the parentheses, and we've got this ability to bind to events. And the nice thing here, and where I think this consistency aspect starts to show, is we can pass any event name in there. So there's no kind of guessing when it comes to the way that we interact with an API. When we interact with the API of Angular, there's no kind of guessing as to how it's done. We just have to pass an event name in. So this could be a mouse enter or a mouse leave or any event like that, and things would work as we'd expect them to. And the last one is called structural directives. So if you're coming from Angular 1 again, you're probably used to some of these directives that come from it, some of the things like ng-if or ng-show, those kinds of things. And in Angular 2, we've got similar things, and they're accessed via the star. But the nice thing is that they're far more simplified in Angular 2. So in Angular 2, we've got ng-if, for instance. So we do star ng-if on some elements, and that's going to conditionally show and hide that element based on some condition. And the example here is that if our user is authenticated, we do some kind of check to check the authentication state of a user. If they are authenticated, then we want to display their email, for instance, on the screen. So these are kind of what I'm considering these 4 pillars of dynamic templates. And the reason for that is that if you learn these things and kind of see the similarities in how you might apply them to various elements in your template, and you see kind of this consistency and this predictability around them, you can really hit the ground running creating your own Angular 2 applications. And this is kind of a nice feature, I think, of Angular 2, in that things are consistent and predictable. If you wanted to take a look at how it all works together, here's an example. So in this case, we're using the ng4 directive. And so that's giving us access to a list of users. And we take one of the users on each iteration through this loop that we've got set up in this ng4 directive. And then we bind that user image to the source property of this image tag, again, using those square brackets for our property binding. And then we also are templating out or interpolating the user's name. And then we're listening for a click on that A tag. And so these are kind of some of the ways that you'd interact and you'd make a template. And this is kind of, I would argue, half the battle when you're creating applications. This is kind of half of what you got to do. Another way that I think Angular makes things consistent and predictable is through what our number 5 is today, and that's component-based architecture. So it may be that you've written an application in the past where you've got a whole bunch of different functionality and a whole bunch of different pieces to it, and you've had to sort of make things kind of fit together in some way, but you weren't sure what the best way for things to fit together was. Maybe your code started looking a little bit like spaghetti code, and it started to interweave with code that was somewhere else in your application. And so that's overall just not a very pleasant way to develop applications. And so instead, Angular gives us these kind of basic building blocks when it comes to crafting our applications. What we get is this prescription, really, of how to put together our applications. And really, it's just a class and a template when it comes down to it. That's all you need for a component. And there's some really great benefits, I think, to having this component-based architecture approach. One of them is that you can kind of split your application up into these discrete functional chunks. So you can have something over here like a dog component on the left and then a cat component on the right. And these things are very different from one another, and that's perfectly fine. They can kind of sit on their own. You don't have to worry about things kind of weaving between one another.
Hello? All right, looks like we hit some snags. So, this is, I guess, our intermission, right? Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Ryan to come back, I guess I'll just, keep us moving along. Like Ryan was saying, this is a really great way to kind of segment our application. And we have a dogs component, a cats component, and Ryan's back.
Hey guys, sorry about that. The connection dropped there. So where did I cut off, Chris?
I believe we were on the dogs cats components.
Yeah, so basically the idea here is that you can kind of split things up into these kind of discrete parts, right? There's this ability to have, something over here like a dogs component that's totally not concerned at all with another component, maybe a cats component over here on the right. These are two totally different things, and you don't have to worry about them colliding at all. And where this really comes in handy is when you start to work in teams and you want to split your work up between different team members. So in the past, if you have multiple people working on an application, what you might find is that if Chris is working over here on the dogs component and I'm working on the cats component, the problem is that we start to step on each other's toes a little bit because parts of our code for our own pieces of the application can start to collide a little bit. But with the component-based approach, we've got sort of this encapsulation around our individual kind of concerns, and we don't have to worry about things bleeding over. Now, one of the other reasons why components are great is for reusability. So if you're kind of smart about it and you want to take kind of the I guess I would say the best approach for reusability, what you would do is you would split, you would have your components be kind of presentational in nature when it's applicable, and those components would be reusable. So you would set them up such that you can totally reuse your components in multiple different places in your application. All right. So what we're going to talk about now is we're going to show you a little bit how you might approach doing a component. So kind of the very basics to how you do a component. So what I'll do is I will share my screen here, and I'll hop over to my editor. And so this is kind of a really basic component. I've got things set up here, kind of scaffolded out already. And what we want to do here is set up the template. So a little bit of a tour first, though, of the component. In Angular, you're working with imports. So the import statement, this new language feature that Chris was talking about in the latest JavaScript. And from Angular's core package, we want to import the component decorator. And so a component decorator here is what's going to give our class, our user component class, some metadata. And that metadata includes things like a selector. So we want to have a selector, something that we can use as an HTML element that we can refer to this component by. We want a template, so what the view will consist of, the HTML that will go into the view. And then we'll want some styles as well. And what I'm doing here is when the component initializes, we're going to call ng-on-init so that we can hook into that lifecycle, hook for when the component initializes. And we're going to say that we want to have this users array here be populated with some objects. And that is going to consist right now just of Chris and I here. So 2 elements in this array, these objects that are basically our information. So why don't we craft the template, and we'll reach for those kind of 4 pillars of dynamic templates that I was referring to. So we might do something like create a div, and we could use here one of our structural directives, the ng-for directive. And why don't we say let user of users. So I'm taking for each of the users in my users array here, I'm taking one of those, and that's where I can operate on it. So we'll close off that div, and let's come down here and close it off down here as well. And so what I might like to do is maybe put an h2 out and use our interpolation, so our double curly braces here, to get the user's name on the screen. So we can say user.name. So because I have this name property on each of my users, I can call it here from each iteration over this collection of users. I can get the name out on the screen. So let's close that off. And down here, we might want to do an image tag, for instance, right? So we might want to say, OK, let's get the user's image. And that's where we'd reach for our property binding. And our property binding, again, is where we can bind something from our data, something from our component, to some property on whatever element we're interested in. So here, it's the source tag. And in the source tag, let's say that we want to get the user image. The user's image on the screen. And then let's reach for that last of our kind of pillars now. So let's do a button. And within the button, we want to maybe say the user's name. So we'll do say name. And what we can do now is reach for a click event. So again, we use the parentheses to denote that we're listening for an event. And in that click event, let's call a say name method. And we'll pass in the user that we're currently on. And that say name method I've already got set up down here. Basically, all it does is it takes a user in, and it's going to alert the user's name onto the screen. All right, so let's save that and check it out now in the browser. So if I'm over here, I'll just wait for my application to reload. And here we go. So we got Chris and I showing up on the screen now. There's our images, and we can click, and we get our names out on the screen. And just kind of by way of example here, I was mentioning, there's this aspect of consistency across these different tools we've got with Angular, and we can demonstrate that by simply, let's say we wanted to use our event binding again. Maybe what we would do is we'd want a mouse over. We'd want to respond to a mouse enter event. So really, we just take that same method call and bind it to an event of mouse enter this time. And it looks very similar to what we saw down here. All we're doing is we're passing a different event name. So if we come back, what we've got is whenever I mouse over the images, they are displaying in that alert. And same with our button click as well. So that's kind of what components look like, just at a really kind of high level. That's sort of your most basic component almost is going to look like this. But the key here is, again, if you know these kind of 4 pillars is what I'm calling them, these 4 things, you can really get going quite quickly with Angular applications. And you might be wondering now, like, isn't this a little bit much to kind of do by hand? There's all these different files here that go into components and various pieces of the application. And the answer to that is, yeah, it's a lot of stuff, but thankfully, we've got a lot of great tools from the community. And one of those great tools is the Angular CLI. So we'll head back to the slides now. And basically, the Angular CLI is this awesome tool that comes kind of from the community, based on the Ember CLI initially, but kind of unto its own now. And the Angular CLI is got a lot of awesome features that can help us get applications up and running quickly, give us a way to serve applications, and do all sorts of really cool things. So there's what the website looks like. I'd encourage you to check it out, cli.angular.io. And this is kind of how it works. So if we wanted to install a new application or create a new Angular 2 application, it's basically just comes down to 2 things. We do npm install, and we say we want to install the CLI globally. And then we just basically have to create a new application by doing ng new, and then you give your application a name. So that's all that's really required. You got to kind of install the CLI and then get the application going. And where this really helps us too is when we're talking about creating all these files that go into our components. So you'd want to have an HTML file in a lot of cases that goes along with your component, a CSS file. And what we can do is use the generators that come from the CLI to help us out with this. So for example, if we wanted to generate a component, this is kind of what the command looks like. It's ng for generate, and then you give the name of what you want to generate, and then you give the name of that component in this case. So here we're generating a component called contact list. And this is kind of what it looks like. So if we take a look at this GIF right here, basically what you do, you pass in the kind of command that you're after. In this case, it's a command to generate the component, and you just let it go to work. You let the CLI go to work. It'll create the files for you that you need. And so what we get with that now is we get this nice set of files for us. Everything's already kind of already done for us, and all we've got to do now is go to work on implementing the logic and the templates for our application. So that's one of the really cool kind of tools that helps us. Another kind of really cool piece about components is something called style encapsulation that can help us be a little bit more safe when we're writing our applications. And Chris is going to talk to you all about what style encapsulation is and how it works. Chris, it looks like you're still muted there. I'm seeing some people in the channel saying that you're muted. All right, guys. So sorry about this. Chris is having some technical difficulties. There's a bit of an audio problem. So I think instead of me going through his slides, because he is the master of his own slides, what we'll do instead is take some questions. So I'm checking the Scotchenar hashtag right now to see if there's any questions there. And it looks like there is not very much going on in the hashtag itself. But what we can do is take some questions in the YouTube chat. So let's see if you guys want to post some questions in the YouTube chat. If you've got anything, feel free. Otherwise, you can again put it into Twitter. You can do the hashtag Scotchenar, and that's going to show up for us to answer your questions. If you don't want to ask questions, feel free to give your opinions on Angular 2. We've taken you kind of halfway through this, these reasons for why we think Angular 2 is great, but maybe you're not convinced yet. If that's the case, you can tell us right in here. So we got one question here. How do media queries work with components? And so I'm guessing that that means how do you do CSS media queries in your components? So if you want to take you know, some kind of breakpoints in your screen size and apply different styles conditionally based on that, really it's just the same as you would normally find in any other kind of application in your CSS. And you take your CSS and you put it you put your media query into it, and then you can basically do media queries just like you would normally do. Another question here: do you need a plugin for TypeScript with Visual Studio Code? So, good question. So VS Code, great editor. I'd highly recommend that you check out VS Code if you don't already have it, especially if you're doing anything in TypeScript or just modern JavaScript. It's a great editor for anything that you could be doing. Kind of getting up to parity or even surpassing in a lot of ways stuff that Sublime does. We're seeing this whole ecosystem of plugins now for VS Code. So it's a great choice of editor. I would say that, so the answer to this question is like, do you need any kind of plugins to work with TypeScript? VS Code is going to do type hinting for you just automatically. There's no need to do any kind of plugins if you want to use TypeScript in VS Code, but you can get some plugins that are really cool to help you do other things. So one of them, what you've seen us do in our code so far, is we've got import statements, right? So we are able to import various pieces of our application to use in our components. And where plugins help us is we can get a VS Code plugin to type out what import we want and have that auto-completed and automatically pulled into our file for us. So that can be really helpful. Taking a look at some other questions here. What has changed in Angular 2 comparing to Angular 1 in productivity technically? What's have they changed? So I would argue that you can be a lot more productive once you are kind of up to speed with Angular 2. You've got this opportunity to be really, really productive. More so, I would argue than Angular 1. And the reason for that is, like we just saw, we've got these really cool things with stuff like the Angular CLI, right? So the Angular CLI gives us the ability to generate all of the pieces of the component that we need. We can generate our services, the files for our services, and pipes. So pipes being what used to be called I guess they're pipes in Angular 2. The name is escaping me right now what they were called in Angular 1 because it's been so long since I've used them. So if somebody wants to chime in and remind me, I don't know why it's slipping my mind. But we can generate all these things, and that alone, the ability to kind of just run a command and have these files generated makes us a lot more productive. Being able to import things and do all sorts of stuff like that is also really helpful for productivity. So I am just going to check to see if Chris is back on before I go into any more questions. So I hear you, Chris.
You guys hear me?
We gotcha. So why don't we slide right into your next section, which is all about style encapsulation.
Right on. So this mic right here is useless. So let's move forward and back to our slides. Okay, so when we're talking about using packages, a lot of times we can have a panel class, and then we can have a couple team members try to override that panel class. So the cool thing about components is that they can have style encapsulation. So if we go over to Visual Studio Code and we visit our application, let's take a look at our starter, our Angular 2 starter. We don't need to save anything there. We can look at our app component, which is our overall app component that's going to house our entire application. And here I have a dog component. Let's split these two up. And we have a dog component and an app component. What's really cool here is I can add on our app component, I can add styles and give this a new panel styling. And we'll say this is the background of red. And this is not going to look very pretty, but we're going to use this as our panel. And then here on our dog component, let's change this to a panel as well. Panel. And once we save that, nothing will happen yet because we have our dog component here. And we actually are going to use that selector, and we're going to use that over here in our template. And we'll spell that correctly. And then we close that out. So now we have a panel in our app component. We have a panel in our dog component as well. Let's take this a step further, and we'll add some styles to our dog component. And this background we'll say is green. Save that, and let's go take a look at our application now. Okay, now we have our panel here in our app component, and we have our panel here in our dog component. So notice, let's go take a look at our inspect element. That is gigantic. All right, so our panel here is background green, and notice there's no background red anywhere to override that. Now, why is that? So Angular 2's components do some really cool things by adding a custom attribute to each element. So if we look down here, we have dog component, and then we have these weird attributes that got added on, nghost qdx-2. And this is what Angular 2 does when it adds the styles to our components. We go down, we look at our head of our document, and notice there's panel, and it directly targets that component itself. So now you don't get any information that transfers over from one component to the next. So that's a small but really neat feature about how you can really see how components kind of live in their own little world. So going back, let's get back to our slides. That was our demo there. We'll move into number 8, which is a really cool tool called Augury. Now this is a third-party tool that the Angular 2 team has embraced and brought into the fold. So Augury, if you ever use Batarang for Angular 1, this is going to be very similar. What this does is it adds a tab to your Chrome DevTools, and it lets you see how your applications run. You can find this tool at augury.angular.io, and I think it is essential for Angular 2 development, really. Let's go back over to our browser. Let's go over to the Augury tab. And in the Augury tab, we can see our app component, and I hope that's large enough. We have our app component and our dog component. Now, what's cool about this is if you're in Angular 1, you want to know what variables you have instantiated at that time. You have to kind of console log maybe and start debugging that way. But if you look at your app component, we have here are all the variables that are in this class, in this component. So we can actually change this on the fly and say, my new message, and that will immediately change right there in our applications. So another really cool tool that Angular 2 has, and it really helps us to kind of see what's going on in our applications. We can see our component tree. If we had routing, we could see how our entire application was routed and start to see how variables are kind of moved around. So after Augury, those are two really cool things that Angular 2 does. Let's move back into our slides, and let's go into number 9, which is that Angular 2 isn't just a browser thing anymore. It's actually really multi-platform.
So Angular 2 has this kind of philosophy right out of the box that it would be nice if we can do stuff with our applications in more environments than just the browser. So you might be used to this whole concept of like a front end application only being able to exist in a browser, and so that was the case with Angular 1. It could only be loaded in the browser, and so it might not be immediately kind of obvious why we'd want to be able to target other platforms, but there's some really good reasons, really solid reasons why we would want to. So going beyond the browser allows us to do really cool things. There's a lot of possibilities that open up, and one of those is if we can load our Angular 2 application on the server side, if we can render a view on the server side, we're able to do some things that really help out our application. So there's this project called Angular Universal. Maybe you've heard of it. What it is, the intent of it is to basically render your application's first view on the server. And what this means is that when somebody comes to your application, when they plug in your URL, they're going to get a loading of your application much more quickly than they would if it was all just loaded onto the client and then wired up and bootstrapped from there. So basically what this means is you're going to have a faster perceived loading time, and that's really, really helpful. That's crucial for user engagement, for keeping people's attention, for conversion rates for your application, all sorts of stuff like that. Another thing that it does for us is it gives us really reliable search engine crawling. One of the problems in the early days of Angular 1 was that there was this difficulty in having Google and other search engines properly index an application. So because things are dynamic, because nothing is rendered by the server, it was difficult for search engines to make sense of all that and to properly index your site. So it was hard to do things like SEO. Now there's a lot that's changed since then. So Google's really good now at recognizing single page applications, but there's all sorts of other search engines that aren't able to do that quite as well. And it's kind of, if we do this universal approach where we render our first view on the server, it really does give us the best way of making our applications really, really crawlable and indexable by search engines. So it's kind of the most reliable way. And then finally, what we get with Angular Universal is this ability to properly display our applications when they get shared around. So perhaps you've seen before somebody sharing a link on Twitter or Facebook, and what you see in the preview for that page is just a bunch of curly braces and stuff that looks like calls to various properties on different objects and stuff like that, something that doesn't make sense at all. And that's because there is this difficulty in properly displaying something that is dynamic, right? There's not really this great ability to be able to display text that is going to be rendered later on in your application's lifecycle after it bootstraps. But with Universal, we've got the ability to have this kind of done for us when the application is first accessed, because it's being rendered on the server. So those are some great features of Angular Universal, and it's really, really helpful for applications all around. And then finally, we'll talk about what we're calling, so this is number 10 now, our last one. We're calling this the rest. There's way too many things to pack into just a session like this. So there's all sorts of other benefits to Angular 2 that we think are really cool. Chris will talk to you about some of these last ones here before we wrap up. Chris, not sure if you're muted or not, but check your mic again.
Audio problems, man. All right, so we're back. Yeah, so number 10 is the rest, and this is cheating, absolutely. We are throwing all of these great things into one number because we feel like there's no way we could cram them all into 10 reasons. So we're going to provide some links we think that would be great to go ahead and go look at yourselves. So number 1 is the Angular style guide. This is something that was kind of a problem in Angular 1. There wasn't really an official style guide until towards the closer to like the previous couple years of its life cycle. And those even were community driven. That was John Papa's, Todd Motto's among the popular ones. This Angular 2 comes with a style guide out of the box. So I would definitely recommend to go look at that, kind of see what the best practices are for building Angular 2 apps. Next up is Angular Material. A lot of us are really big fans of the Material kind of design language and how things maneuver and that UI and whole UX feel of that. Material.angular.io is a great place to go look for the Angular 2 Material package. Next up, this is going to be last, but certainly definitely not least. The Angular IO docs. So the Angular 2 docs are far and away better than the Angular 1 docs. I know that many of you have probably visited the Angular 1 docs, finding it from a search term, and noticed that it didn't really provide everything you needed. It wasn't the most helpful thing. The Angular 2 docs do away with that. They have great examples. They have great code snippets. And the API documentation is where I would definitely recommend to go look if you're trying to see how to use certain directives or classes that come with Angular 2. So all that said, these are some really great things that Angular 2 is doing correctly moving forward. And it's learned a lot from all of the lessons from the Angular 1 era. So moving forward, do we think that Angular 2 actually makes development easier? And we absolutely, that is a resounding yes in our book. And I'll let Ryan.
Yeah, so I mean, for us, the answer is yes. There's a bit of bias here that we'll admit, and the bias is that we've gotten a bit familiar with Angular 2 now. Chris and I, we've gotten comfortable with it. We're starting to learn these different concepts, and what we'll admit, I guess, is that there is a learning curve, right? These things require a learning curve. That's just kind of par for the course when you're dealing with a new framework that's got as many new kind of modern features as Angular 2 does. What we'd like for you guys to come away from this webinar with, and hopefully we've been able to show you with these different demos and stuff, is that even though there is this learning curve involved, Angular 2 at the end of the day is going to make your life easier as a developer. There's just so much great stuff packed into it that you will have this kind of really rich set of tools to be able to do all sorts of things that would be pretty difficult to do before Angular 2. So we've got stuff like ES6 and 7 built in, kind of built on that, and TypeScript. You know, those are at the core of Angular 2. The framework is built in TypeScript, and that just helps us for things like making sure our application is using correct types and we're not passing incorrect data to different methods and stuff like that, even before we load our application. So that helps us in terms of like development time, because we don't have to go to our application after we load it in the browser and find out at some later point that we've done something incorrectly. We've got all sorts of speed and performance boosts Chris took you through. So just faster out of the box, really performance, and that's going to help you. That's ultimately going to be good for your development, for your clients, if you're making applications for clients, or for your companies. You know, you're going to have really fast apps out of the box. We've got these consistent concepts. We talked about the 4 pillars of dynamic templates, and those have some they have this like great amount of consistency across the board. You can kind of learn these concepts and then be able to predict how to use them in other areas. After you've maybe made one template, you can kind of it's predictable how you would go about making other templates. We've got a component-based architecture with Angular 2. That really helps us for splitting things into blocks and then bringing them together to create the overall application. We've got some great tools from the community. Angular CLI allows to generate all the stuff we need for our components and our services and everything else, and it really speeds up development time. We've got stuff like a style encapsulation, like Chris showed you. So basically, we can set up our CSS such that it doesn't bleed from one component to the next. And that's going to be really helpful when it comes to changing things down the line. If you've ever worked on a big CSS file in some application and then you need to go make a change to it later, it can get pretty daunting if you have to go and tear the thing apart and deal with all sorts of cascading changes, right? And we've also got some other tools like Augury that helps us to inspect our applications. Angular 2, again, is multi-platform. So this means we can load it in other places. We can do universal. We can also do stuff like use native scripts so that we can have Angular loaded on a native device. And there's many more benefits as well. There's lots more to it. We've really just had time to skim the surface here. So with that said, hopefully you guys kind of come away with some greater understanding of why Chris and I, anyway, and many others in the community think that Angular 2 is a winner, why it's kind of here to stay. And at this time, I think what we'll do is take any more questions that you guys have. So once again, the Scotch and R hashtag on Twitter. That is where you can drop your questions, but it looks like there still isn't much there. So once again, we'll check the YouTube chat just to see if there's anything else. And I don't know that there is. Looks like most people are kind of on their way out. We are at our time limit anyway. So what we'll do, just to quickly wrap up here, is let you guys know about a few of the things where you can get some more information, where you can kind of go from here. And as I mentioned at the top, I'm founder of this brand new site called AngularCast. So AngularCast is a website basically that's dedicated to AngularJS screencasts. So that's going to be really in-depth Angular 2 stuff. So a lot of screencasts are going to be focused on Angular 2 because that's kind of the newest of the new. And this is going to take you from beginner stuff to advanced stuff. So there's going to be a whole kind of gamut of material there. And it's going to go beyond Angular as well. So we're going to do stuff where we talk about backends and databases and deployments and all sorts of other things that go into making an application. Because the truth of it is that it's not just about the front end when it comes to making an application. You've got to consider all sorts of other things, and how to deploy your application, for instance, is often kind of a tricky one. So we're going to talk about all sorts of stuff around that as well, basically to get you from the point where you start up an Angular 2 application in development to pushing it to production. So everything that's involved with that. Now, the full launch is going to be in January. So it's in pre-launch mode right now. And the pre-launch special that I've got for you guys is if you go to the site and you want to subscribe, you will get 50% off for life. So instead of just having basically a 50% off deal for right now, you get 50% off for life if you sign up during the pre-launch time. So check it out at angularcast.io. That is where you can go to see a preview of what's coming. You can go and check out my Getting Started with Angular 2 course there. So there's a course up. There'll be some more preview material that's coming up in the next few days as well. And this will give you a sense of what you can expect when everything is fully launched. So check that out. I encourage you guys to sign up either for a subscription. You'll get 50% off for life. Or if you want to, just drop in your email. There's a spot there where you can be notified of other things that are going on with AngularCast. You can be notified of release dates and stuff like that. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And I'll pass it back over to Chris now for wrapping us up completely.
Right on. Yeah, absolutely, guys. Check out AngularCast. Ryan, quality content, quality. He just gets how to, teach certain topics that are, usually seen as complicated. So he really breaks things down really well. Definitely check out angularcast.io. So thanks for everyone here at Scotch. Thanks for watching. Really, I just want to go back and say thank you for kind of following along and being there with us. So real quick, we have our Getting Started with Angular 2 course, and that is a free course. You can get it at this really short link here, and we'll paste that in the chat and also in the description of this. But you can find that over on Scotch School, which is something we launched in the previous months. And that's just kind of our next step forward, we feel like. We've been writing articles, and you know what, let's switch over. All right, so I just want to get my face out there and say hi and thank you for everyone for coming to the site, for reading our articles. We've been around for about 3 years now. We have a small team of 4, and we can't thank you enough for all of the guest authors that are coming in, all of the readers that are coming in, and any feedback you guys give is always super welcome. So yeah, moving forward, we want to talk about what's coming up next. And in our eyes, 2017 is going to be a huge year. We're going to release this new thing for, we want to release this kind of documentation guide kind of hybrid. So we feel like a lot of our content is getting kind of buried down the wayside, and it's hard to find like the beginner articles that you need to start up with a framework, maybe Angular 2, whatever it is. So we'll have these really cool kind of guides to work you along your way of learning. We're going to do Scotchbox 3.0. A lot of you have been wanting that to get upgraded, and that's coming. But moving forward, just thank you again for supporting. And so moving forward, if you want to write, definitely email us. pub.scotch.io is our community. School.scotch.io is our video courses. And we'll definitely be doing another one of these soon. Hopefully one every month is our goal right now. Maybe every 2 weeks, maybe every week. But we'll see. Thank you guys so much for watching, from all the entire team here at Scotch, from Ryan. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Thanks also for putting up with the technical difficulties that we had today as well, for kind of sitting through any of the glitches that we had. We appreciate it. So we'll catch you guys soon. Thanks very much for joining.